what happens is you have these really, really great response programs that have been built, and they've been utilized. They're not being well utilized or hadn't been well utilized until Bitcoin mining came around. Various industries can say, here, this is my bid. This is what I'm willing to do. I'll commit to be in the program and available for as a resource to respond if there's a shortage in supply. Well, most industries aren't very good at responding or participating, so they can only bid to a certain level. And so what's happening is Bitcoin miners are actually bidding those other resources out of the market. In fact, Bitcoin miners got so good at participating in the demand response program, these industries are very interested in limiting the ability for Bitcoin mining to participate in the grid. And in fact, that's why we believe SB 1751 exists in the first place.
This is the Bitcoin Effect, where we talk about Bitcoin and its effects on politics, society, and economics. Stick around a while and let me know in the comments what you'd like us to cover in future videos. All right, welcome back to the Bitcoin Effect. I am joined by Dennis Porter from the Satoshi Action Fund and Satoshi Action Education. And we've been talking a lot about state legislation and where some of the victories have been, specifically in Arkansas, Montana. He talked about a couple of counties in North Carolina that are problematic because they've actually put a moratorium on Bitcoin mining. Before I go to the national questions that I told you that I was going to get to, let me ask you, are there any particular battlegrounds that you are preparing to actually enter into as far as different states are concerned in the coming legislative sessions that are coming up?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and one thing that we should not miss talking about is what happened in Texas. So Texas has been known as the epicenter for Bitcoin mining specifically over the last year, ever since the China exodus. In Texas, Bitcoin mining has not only grown its footprint, it has grown its ability to interact with and balance the grid. It's really kind of almost like a fairy tale, a true story fairy tale, and like what success you can have with Bitcoin mining when you incorporate it. Fortunately, at least for Bitcoin mining, the state of Texas has its own grid managed and operated by ERCOT. It's a very different situation than any other RTO, ISO, or grid operation across the country. Every other grid and RTO and ISO is all part of kind of a larger system. So you have the East and West interconnect. And then within those, you have various RTOs and ISOs, regional transmission organizations or independent system operators. And these are just basically people that manage the grid, to make it simple, over a regional area, sometimes state specific. New York and California both have their own ISOs. But those ISOs and RTOs are all managed by FERC, let's say where they're regulated by FERC. So FERC is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. So it's very clearly by its name, obviously a federal entity, federal organization. And out of all the 7 RTOs and ISOs out there, ERCOT is the only one that is not underneath of that umbrella. It is completely independent. There's good things and bad things because of that. Bad things can be that sometimes they run into energy shortages that other places don't experience. The good thing, though, is that because they're kind of on their own, they've been forced to develop more advanced telemetry measuring systems for their grid and better grid balancing services to make sure that their grid stays operational in emergencies or to be able to manage the various types of changes in demand, supply and demand on the grid. And they've developed these really advanced grid balancing programs. Some of them, many of you in the Bitcoin space will recognize the name demand response. There's also what I would call its younger cousin, which is frequency regulation or frequency response. Both basically are, serve kind of the same purpose ultimately, which is to balance the grid. I would say demand response is more of a, we're about to go over the total available supply on the grid. We need to find ways to cut our demand so we don't go over the available supply, because if you go over the available supply, you can crash the grid. So they look for customers to kind of curtail. Frequency response balances the grid in a different way. It is monitoring and making sure that the heartbeat of the grid stays synchronous. The grid sits at 60 hertz all the time in the United States, 50 hertz in Europe, and you have to maintain that number within a very tight, narrow range at all times. If you don't, the grid will collapse. So Bitcoin is very good at both of these things. So that's been very good for the fact that Texas has so well developed these, what are called ancillary service programs, demand response, frequency response. There's also voltage regulation. But that wouldn't be happening if you did not have a grid which was really needing to make sure that it was balanced all the time. Because in the East and West interconnect, they can just go, oh, we're having some problems. Let's pull some energy over here. Let's pull some energy over there. It's a very large, vast network. Texas, it's much. I mean, even though it's a big state, it's a much smaller area, so they have to manage all of that and do it without any sort of ability to rely on their states that connect to them, RTOs and ISOs that connect to them. For the most part, there are some. I'm putting a lot of detail in here, but I don't want people to say I don't know what I'm talking about. There are some connections; they're just not big enough to be able to manage any sort of big changes in supply and demand. Well, what happens is you have these really, really great response programs that have been built, and they've been utilized. They're not being well utilized or hadn't been well utilized until Bitcoin mining came around. So Bitcoin mining, because it is, in my opinion, and I think inarguably, the best demand response customer on the planet, has filled that void that Texas has had, where they haven't been able to find a whole lot of people to participate in the demand response program. In fact, Bitcoin miners got so good at participating in the demand response program that they're bidding down the cost of offering that service. So every time you have this demand response program out there, you're like, okay, who's going to participate? Various industries can say, here, this is my bid. This is what I'm willing to do. I'll commit to be in the program and available for as a resource to respond if there's a shortage in supply. I will volunteer for that. They get paid for it. Any industry gets paid for it. And then if they call on you, you get paid again. Well, most industries aren't very good at responding or participating. And so they don't really, they can only bid to a certain level. And so what's happening is Bitcoin miners are actually bidding those other resources out of the market. In our opinion, I think we need a little more data to back it up, but that's my early opinion on what's happening. And so because of that, again, in my opinion, can't really prove it, these industries are very interested in limiting the ability for Bitcoin mining to participate in the grid. And in fact, that's why we believe SB 1751 exists in the first place.
Is it because other industries were beginning to lose revenue that would have come from those response programs?
Absolutely.
Okay.
100%. Bitcoin mining is vastly better at participating, that it can bid lower and lower and lower, and it's edging the other people out of the market. And so what they did is they used the power or the levers of government to restrict the ability for Bitcoin mining to participate in the grid. Now, I'm not saying necessarily that was the intent of the policymaker who introduced it, but it became seemingly clear that was the intention all along. Like there was another part in there where it's about limiting Bitcoin miners and their ability to participate in tax abatements, to be able to get incentives that are created when you create jobs in rural communities. You get tax abatements, whatever. They were willing to throw that to the side if Bitcoin miners could be limited in their ability to participate in demand response. They wanted to limit it to 10%. There's floating numbers out there that at any given time that miners are anywhere from 5 to 20% of that. So it would have automatically, day one passing, had a cap limit on Bitcoin miners and their ability to participate. Totally anti-free market, by the way. We were really surprised by it.
To use a crude analogy, basically you have the wagon builders trying to utilize the government to keep the car manufacturers from coming in and actually making transportation better.
That's a great analogy.
Because Bitcoin miners, as far as their overhead is concerned, most of their 90% of their overhead has to do with the electricity that they're utilizing in order to create the hash rate. If I'm right, and when they're able to shut off, they don't lose as much in overhead as what these other industries are losing in overhead and in production when they choose to actually give up the electricity so that the grid can maintain its balance. Am I right in that assumption?
That's exactly right. That's 100% accurate. So because Bitcoin mining is a purely digital industry, there's no supply chain. There's no input, no output. It's all digital. Whereas with a steel plant, which is traditionally a very good resource for participating in demand response, there's input, you have raw steel, and then you have fine steel, right? But when you turn your operation off, you interrupt that supply chain. So it can cause problems with the supply chain itself. And in the instances of other types of industries, it's not just the supply chain, it's also the damage that it can do to the process itself. I've talked to some people there. This is a random example, but I was talking to someone who does Records, who does vinyl, right? And they said if they turned their machines off, it would destroy everything. All of it would be broken. And in fact, that actually happened during that last winter storm. They were forced to shut down, and it destroyed all of their equipment. So not everybody can participate purely from a processes standpoint. And then also those that can participate, like say they don't incur sorts of like massive amounts of damage, they can only do it for so much time. They can't just do it all day, every day, nonstop. Serious problems are created within the supply chain itself. So Bitcoin miners don't have any of those problems. There's no supply chain. It doesn't damage the machines. Some people have stated that there might be mild amounts of damage that can occur over time, but you're not going to break your Bitcoin mining machine just because you turn it off for 4 or 5 hours or for a couple of days, so to speak. So this bill, like you said, is essentially the last industry that was best at participating in these programs, using government to limit the ability for Bitcoin miners to participate because they were so much better at it than they were.
Wow. So we're all glad that bill is dead, because not only for Bitcoin miners, but for free markets themselves. Because once you inject the government into what's effectively price fixing, then you don't have free markets anymore, and you suddenly have supply and demand issues anyway.
Well, it's not just bad for Bitcoin miners too, and for free markets. It's actually bad for Texans, because Bitcoin miners are a reliable, effective, affordable resource for the grid. And if you're limiting the ability for Bitcoin miners to participate, you're taking the best tool out of the toolbox for Texans to be able to have cheap, affordable, reliable energy. So it's bad for everybody. It's not just bad for Bitcoin miners. It's like saying, we created, it's the exact example with, the car situation, right? Like we created this automobile, it does everything perfectly. Now we should stop this because it's good for their industry and not for ours. Well, as we all know, cars have done a lot to advance the human cause. Our travel time, having to clean up horse poop, definitely some benefits of having to deal with a car instead of a horse pulling you around everywhere.
Absolutely. And from my standpoint, from what you're talking about here, with the grid, Bitcoin mining and the ability to literally turn it on and turn it off becomes the best response regulator that could actually possibly exist for the Texas grid system.
That's right. There's, batteries are one, I would say industry. The battery industry is one resource that responds well, but outside of batteries, there really isn't anything else out there that can turn on and consume a lot of load in a very short period of time, and then also turn off very rapidly. Some people have gotten the turn off times, I would say about a 90 to 95% peak load reduction within fractions of a second. I mean, there's just no one else that can do that. But then on the flip side, when they need them to come back online, that can also be done very rapidly. I think to get all the way back up to where it was previously, there's all sorts of different approaches to how to shave that number down. Like for instance, I was talking to a software guy the other day, and it normally would be like, 2 minutes to get back all the way up to full boot and to be hashing. Well, they figured out that they could actually cut that time in half if they just didn't worry about actually hashing. So they can consume power, and for a minute or two, there won't be any sort of hash going on, but it's consuming almost all of the power it was before shutting down.
But so there's all sorts of
creative. Go ahead.
They're being reimbursed for that anyway. So so they're actually,
that's right,
sacrificing the revenue while they're still getting reimbursed for it, so that they can actually have a quicker uptime to actually regulate the grid that much better.
That's right. And then the ultimate goal here, the ultimate prize, is not just to do demand response, it's to do frequency regulation at the fastest speeds possible. The faster you can do it, the more valuable it is, the more you'll get paid for it.
Yeah.
There's all sorts of, outside the Bitcoin space is the interesting thing. There's all sorts of efforts to get to that response time through software, through controllers that you put on your load that you have. And now we're kind of almost like getting to the point where Bitcoin mining is going to be, on the bleeding edge of that sort of technology and that ability to balance the grid. And this is, really, really important. I want to say that number 5 there, people say, why do you always say carbon-free energy projects, and particularly renewables, for why Bitcoin mining is valuable? Because unlike coal and unlike gas, and even unlike nuclear, you can throw that one in there, and even to some extent hydro, wind and solar are intermittent energy resources. So they are only on when the wind is blowing, the sun is shining. There's all sorts of deviations, constant deviations in their output, which means that you need to be able to have load that can respond to that. And there just is no other load that can respond to those deviations the way Bitcoin mining can. Batteries, put that one aside because batteries are very expensive and hard to scale. Maybe that'll change. But right now, it's like AC versus DC. Bitcoin mining is the technology that we have available to us today to solve the problems that renewables have. And the number one problem that renewables have is a lack of consistent generation. They are not an on-demand power generation resource.
Thanks for joining us here at The Effect. If you're enjoying the video, I hope you'll consider clicking the like, subscribing to the channel, and dropping a comment with topics you'd like us to cover or guests you'd like us to have a conversation with.